A routine domestic flight in the United States is currently en route to Seattle. However, shortly after takeoff, the plane suddenly disappeared without a trace at an altitude of 10,000 meters. Even stranger, the control tower did not receive any emergency signals or distress messages from the plane. In fact, the radar did not detect any signs of impact or debris from the plane. And when the rescue team finally found the black box, there was only one person left, leaving his final message to the camera with incredible fear.
You have to believe me. It is real. If this plane lands, then if what's on this plane gets on the ground.
Actually, what happened on this flight? Today we will discuss the latest aviation horror film of 2026 entitled Black Box: Deadly Flight. Let's turn back time, just moments before this plane took off. At that time, the passengers were boarding the plane in an orderly manner, assisted by the flight attendants. In the cockpit, the captain, who was checking the aircraft systems, even joked that he hadn't flown an old model aircraft like this for a long time. He really hopes that all these flights will run smoothly and safely. However, he did not know that his bad feeling would soon come true, and the old man in the toilet did not come out. Because she was in a desperate situation, she was finally forced to run to the toilet in the first-class cabin. However, before she could step into the toilet, Chloe was immediately stopped by Darren, an arrogant man who was sitting in first class.
I need to go to the bathroom.
Hey, stewardess.
The arrogant man even immediately called the flight attendant to throw Chloe out of there. Darren arrogantly asserted that he had paid a high price for the comfort of first class. He questioned why economy class passengers were allowed to enter and use the facilities in his area. Hearing the complaint, the flight attendant could not do much and could only apologize to calm the situation. The flight attendant was finally able to calm Chloe down and persuade her to hold back for a while. However, when she walked back to economy class, she didn't know that the old man in the toilet was already sweating profusely with a look in his eyes that was starting to lose consciousness. Seeing Chloe come back with a worried face, Jeremy, who was sitting beside her, didn't stay silent and tried to talk to her. Responding to the greeting, Chloe immediately extended her hand to shake hands. Meanwhile, feeling bad for Chloe, the flight attendant took the initiative to go to the toilet and knocked on the door to check on the situation. After a long time, the door finally opened, and the old man came out drenched in sweat, babbling in the heat. Initially, the flight attendant who knocked on the door just thought that the old man was not feeling well. However, after returning to his seat, the old man continued to cough nonstop. In seeing the chaos, an air marshal or aircraft security officer disguised among the passengers immediately acted quickly to stop it. However, the old man had completely lost control and continued to rebel. After struggling desperately, he managed to free himself and ran back towards the cockpit door. The look in his eyes showed extreme fear, as if he had just seen something very terrible out there. However, just as his hand had just touched the cockpit door handle, the old man could no longer hold back the coughing up of blood that came out of his mouth. However, no matter how hard Jeremy tried to save him, it was too late and completely fruitless. A passenger who initially appeared healthy suddenly died in a very tragic way before everyone's eyes. Seeing the increasingly chaotic situation, the flight attendant rushed to contact the cockpit to report the emergency situation. However, because the plane is currently halfway through its journey, the captain finally decided not to change the flight route and continued the journey to the destination airport. The flight attendant immediately covered the body with a blanket and tied it tightly to the seat to prevent the body from being thrown and hitting the cabin if the plane experienced turbulence. But what not everyone there knows is that in the cargo hold at this moment, all the pet dogs in the cages suddenly started barking wildly in fear. It was as if something very terrifying was now slowly starting to approach them. As soon as Jeremy returned to his seat, he was the first to seeing a mysterious, colorful glimmer of light moving quickly through the clouds. The light moved in a meandering manner within the clouds, as if a giant creature was swimming towards their plane. Without wasting any time, he rushed to report the strange phenomenon to Emma, the flight attendant. However, Emma thought Jeremy was just hallucinating, due to the shock after the doctor had just witnessed a tragic death before his eyes. However, that skepticism immediately disappeared when not long after, Chloe also admitted to seeing the same mysterious flash of light. The light wasn't lightning, nor was it the glittering city lights from below. Instead, it was the flash of a giant firework exploding very close to the plane. And if you stare at the mysterious flash of light for too long, the effect will make your head dizzy immediately and your ears will ring loudly. However, as soon as the sentence left her mouth, Jeremy suddenly realized something terrible. Chloe's ear had started to ooze blood. However, just as he helped wipe the blood off Chloe's ear, Jeremy gasped when he realized that without realizing it, his own ear had also started to ooze fresh blood. Witnessing this, Emma immediately used the plane's radio to ask about the condition of the other passengers.
If any passengers have started feeling sick since departure, could you please press the flight attendant button?
In the cockpit, the captain pilot immediately received an emergency report that several passengers were starting to experience severe dizziness and strange symptoms. The cabin conditions became increasingly tense when the nosebleed symptoms suddenly turned into uncontrollable heavy bleeding. Seeing these terrible mass symptoms, a strong suspicion arose that their plane was being attacked by an unknown, mysterious virus outbreak. For the safety of all passengers, the captain finally took an emergency decision to divert the flight route and immediately land at the nearest airport. Upon hearing the emergency broadcast, Darren immediately jumped up from his seat in a panic. Overcome with panic and emotion, he intended to rush to the cockpit and demand an explanation. Seeing the suspicious movement, an air marshal who was disguised in the cabin quickly came over to stop him. The series of chaotic events that unfolded on the plane apparently completely destroyed Lauren's mental state. As a security officer, she lost her sanity in the midst of a critical situation. Without warning, Lauren, who was already blinded by anger, immediately used physical violence to silence the passenger who she considered to be a troublemaker. Darren actually noticed a very strange abnormality in Lauren's body from close range. Lauren quickly checked herself in the bathroom mirror. Her ear wasn't bleeding, but the corners of her eyes had mysteriously begun to bleed. Meanwhile, in the opposite row of seats, several passengers who were relaxing and listening to music were suddenly startled. A very loud, ear-splitting screech suddenly exploded from the seat. As the plane was getting ready to land at the airport, a mysterious beam of light was suddenly seen passing and radiating from behind the clouds. Seeing this strange phenomenon, the pilot immediately contacted the control tower via radio frequency to ask whether there were any military experiments taking place in the area nearby. However, after checking the radar, air traffic control gave a surprising answer. There was absolutely no military activity or operations in the area tonight. The answer led to a terrifying conclusion. The mysterious light that had just flashed was most likely not created by human technology. At the same time, Darren, who could no longer hold back his emotions, completely lost his temper again. Not only that, this situation is also a sign that a major confrontation will soon explode on the plane in the near future. Seeing that the flight attendant named Rachel was completely unable to calm Darren down, Lauren came back and immediately confronted the man very aggressively. Seeing this, Darren immediately went on alert. With an angry glare, Lauren immediately threatened Darren if he dared to act up again. Lauren emphasized that once the plane landed, she would definitely report all of Darren's actions to the authorities at the airport.
Last warning.
I will have you so fired.
In the next instant, Darren, feeling the upper hand, underestimated the threat. Unexpectedly, Lauren fired a stun gun, sending Darren tumbling to the ground. Meanwhile, the captain shuddered as he stared out the window. A violent, extreme storm had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, blocking their flight path. And what was even more frightening, the storm seemed to have a consciousness of its own and deliberately continued to follow wherever their plane went. Under the influence of the mysterious storm, the aircraft's systems slowly began to become completely paralyzed, which immediately triggered a complete communications blackout. The indicator needles on the cockpit dashboard began to move erratically and uncontrollably. At the same time, the cabin lights flickered amidst the violent shaking that shook the entire fuselage. As the airport was preparing for an emergency landing scenario, the flight suddenly disappeared completely from the radar screens. When the situation was that critical, the unsuspecting passengers simply thought that the plane was experiencing quite severe turbulence. However, as cabin crew, the flight attendants began to feel something was wrong. The rate of descent of the plane felt too fast and abnormal. However, when the flight attendant tried to find out what had happened, the communication channel to the cockpit was no longer reachable. Trying to calm the panic, Lauren assured his colleagues that the plane's autopilot system would still be reliable for the time being. After that, she immediately moved quickly towards the cockpit to check what was actually happening inside. However, having just woken up from his faint, Darren immediately forced himself to step forward and block Lauren's path again. It didn't stop there. This tension triggered mass panic, causing everyone in the first-class cabin to stand up to see what was happening. It turned out the situation was far more dire than initially thought. They all believed that all the economy-class passengers had been infected by a mysterious virus. But at that critical moment, Darren was suddenly stunned. He saw that a female passenger beside him had also mysteriously begun to bleed from the nose. Seeing the horrific scene, Darren no longer cared about the people around him. He immediately turned around and rushed to hide in the bathroom. He immediately closed all the air vents in the toilet. He then used paper towels as makeshift protective clothing and plugged all the gaps in the door to prevent the virus from entering. Outside, Lauren, the security guard, hadn't even had time to press the password button when the cockpit door lock system suddenly went haywire and failed completely. In the midst of the increasingly deadlocked situation, the roar of the extreme storm outside the window grew louder and louder, as if ready to tear their plane apart. In the midst of this tense situation, Emma finally saw with her own eyes the mysterious light they had previously discussed. And as the mysterious light continued to move around the outside of the cabin, the shaking of the plane became increasingly violent and uncontrollable. The sudden, violent jolt instantly threw everyone's bodies, sending the entire cabin into chaos. Just when they thought the plane had finally landed safely, their hopes were dashed. There was no sign of the airport, no lights outside the window. All that remained was the darkness of the sky. Oddly enough, the captain never used the cabin announcement system to provide any updates on their current situation. Amidst the uncertainty, passengers began to come up with various conspiracy theories. They suspected that this place was some kind of quarantine zone, deliberately designed to isolate them. They suspect they have been infected by an experimental virus, and in order to cover this up, the authorities deliberately faked this plane crash to eliminate everyone and the secrets inside. In the midst of a cabin situation that now feels as isolated as outer space, decisive action must be taken to forcibly maintain order before the chaos spreads further. But this time, in the midst of the chaos, Jeremy tries to examine the situation and manages to find a very surprising clue. Who would have thought Jeremy actually found that the heart in the old man's chest had been badly damaged and had stopped beating? Remembering the strange noise that had come from the earphones earlier, Jeremy began to realize something. They were not actually infected by any virus. The old man's body was apparently being hit by extremely powerful frequency waves, an extreme energy that was forcibly stimulating his blood vessels and damaging his nervous system. This deadly wave triggers severe headaches and sudden bleeding, and even begins to manipulate their minds, causing terrifying hallucinations. They decided to write a distress note on a piece of paper, hoping the message would get through to the outside world. They then asked one of the passengers to stick the paper on the cabin window, hoping that the distress message would be seen by anyone outside. But now, amidst the tense silence of the cabin, the sound of footsteps suddenly rang out from above. The sound was so fast and rhythmic, as if someone was walking on the outer shell of the plane. Instantly, everyone held their breath. The cabin fell silent, and all eyes were now fixed on the ceiling in terror. But in the next second, a loud crash shook the hatch. Something from outside was now trying to force its way in. Unbeknownst to the others, Darren thought that the loud knocking came from the rescue workers who had come to pick them up. But before he could take a step, the toilet lid suddenly opened automatically in the next second. Right at that critical moment, Brad remembered something. Thinking there was a rope in his bag, he immediately turned around and ran back to find out what was really going on. But just then, Darren stayed open. However, instead of a monster appearing, a thick wave of white gas gushed in quickly and filled the cabin. Seeing the mysterious gas starting to spread, the flight attendants quickly distributed oxygen masks, while the passengers immediately rushed to put them on for their safety. But soon, from behind without giving any chance to dodge, the alien moved very quickly, using its tentacles to snatch the lives of the passengers one by one. In that instant, the entire cabin turned into a slaughterhouse filled with screams of fear and despair. Unable to remain silent, Lauren fired a barrage of shots to fight back. But to no avail, every bullet she fired was absorbed by the energy shield protecting the alien. Their hopes were completely shattered. With the impenetrable energy shield, there was absolutely no way to stop the brutal slaughter carried out by the aliens. Soon, only a handful of survivors remained, lying limp in the rear cabin area. In mounting panic, they hurriedly gathered whatever belongings were left and piled them in front of the door to create a barrier. The tiny creature immediately jumped and burst into Lauren's mouth. She had no chance of survival. Their only choice was to continue going deeper to save themselves.
Come on!
But in the next second, Lauren, who had mutated, suddenly ambushed him. In order to save the others, Brad decided to sacrifice his life and close the hatch as hard as he could. However, even the tightly closed hatch was unable to hold back the penetration of the monster's tentacles. Panicked by the attack, they hurriedly removed the bolts locking the container door. Then, they pushed the container along the sliding rails to secure the door. Then lock it back so that its position doesn't shift even a little. Those who remained could only survive in silence for weeks on end. Even the pet dog that was previously wild has now fallen silent. Instantly, the atmosphere became very quiet. From his eyes, a cold light radiated that clearly did not belong to an animal. They finally realized they had become the monster's targets. It turned out these creatures were indeed after every remaining soul. Right after successfully taking over the body, the parasite immediately hides under the skin, perfectly disguising itself as its host. Aliens are quietly infiltrating human civilization, and this plane that had just taken off became the perfect killing field for the monster. There was no way out. The plane's windows and ceiling were the only way out into the cabin. Now their only option was the cargo door. Armed with a little hope, Jeremy dared to open it. However, the view outside the hatch succeeded in giving them heart palpitations. It turned out the plane hadn't landed at all. A mysterious force was holding it, leaving it floating motionless in the air. Now, with no way to escape, they could only freeze in silence. Fortunately, despair has not yet managed to break their spirits. They also decided to search the surrounding area, looking for anything that could be used as a survival tool. However, just as someone was about to open the coffin, Jeremy, who was emotional, immediately stepped forward to stop him. It turned out that inside the coffin lay the body of his own wife. Apparently, they both had a tragic accident while camping. One of her major blood vessels ruptured instantly, a massive hemorrhage that claimed her life within seconds. Her last request was simple. She just wanted her husband to remain faithful by her side. While racing against time, Jeremy still desperately ran to find any help that could save his wife's life. But when he returned, it was too late. His wife's life could no longer be saved. Jeremy continues to be plagued by regret, thinking that if only he hadn't left, his wife wouldn't have passed her last breath in solitude. Just when Jeremy was sinking into regret, Emma came along and tried to comfort him. At the same time, the monsters began to aggressively spread parasites to infect humans and make their bodies their hosts. Shortly afterward, the control tower again received a signal transmission from the flight. The captain, now possessed by the parasite, lied, claiming that his plane had simply experienced severe turbulence that triggered the failure of the radar and communication systems. Hearing this explanation, the air traffic controller did not suspect anything at all. They immediately gave permission for the plane to make an emergency. Hearing the scream, the monster finally stopped pretending. In a cold tone, the monster said that everything was unstoppable, because this crisis was not only happening on their ship. They have infiltrated Earth at certain moments, spreading through various means without humans realizing it. They only need to replace humans slowly, until finally the entire world is completely under their grip. However, after hearing the threat, Jeremy still stepped into the cabin without the slightest hesitation. But beyond his expectations, all the passengers in the cabin were revived at the same time. Instantly, their gazes were all fixed on Jeremy in utter horror, as if he were a mad slaughterer brandishing a sharp axe at them. Seeing the scene, Jeremy quickly suppressed the wave and that Jeremy finally completely overhauled his mindset. Without wasting any time, he immediately ambushed and took Emma hostage, who was right in front of him. With extremely fast movements, Jeremy managed to break into the cockpit. Without hesitation, Jeremy immediately charged towards the two pilots. In the control tower, the officers suddenly fell silent and gasped. The code signal 7500 flashed across the screen. The plane had been hijacked. But it was too late for Jeremy. His plan to seize the controls and intentionally crash the plane had already been thwarted. Even though he had made up his mind to die, he still failed to drag his enemies to their common destruction. It all failed simply because the pilot had locked the system into the automatic landing procedure. Without the expertise to fly the aircraft, it would be impossible for him to cancel the automatic system. No matter what Jeremy did, the plane still landed smoothly on the runway. It was only at this moment that it fully dawned on him. Everything that had happened was nothing but part of the aliens' plan. From the start, they were completely unperturbed by Jeremy's resistance. They actually hoped that Jeremy would try to fight back. Because once the plane finally lands, the whole truth will be buried deep within, marking the beginning of the apocalypse for the world. Screamed hysterically in despair that those people were monsters, but no one would listen to him anymore. Meanwhile, the parasitized passengers took advantage of his desperation, pretending to be threatened victims. One by one, they slowly stepped off the plane. No one knew when these aliens would infiltrate and poison the city. Whose body will they use as their next host? The story ends here. However, the real horror was just beginning. In the end, the official managed to find the phone. But in the end, the phone was kept sealed, only because the passengers who recorded the video claimed to have been threatened by Jeremy. The most desperate part of the film is not actually when the plane manages to land, but the fact that Jeremy had spoken the truth as honestly as he could, but no one wanted to believe him. Because according to the rules of the normal world, a man standing covered in blood with a gun in his hand is clearly the criminal. Because someone who keeps shouting and accusing those around him of being aliens in a sane world would definitely be considered to have lost his mind. Herein lies the greatest irony in the conclusion of this story. The blind figure is the only one who sees reality, while the cell phone recordings that hold real evidence are locked away without anyone knowing. Because when a truth feels too unreasonable, humans will instinctively choose to deny it. Therefore, an invasion no longer requires large-scale destruction to conquer the world. The threat preys on one thing: our own arrogance and the false sense of security we build on the order we believe in. Imagine if the closest person in your life suddenly felt like a stranger. His smile was the same, his intonation was the same, and all his memories were intact. But he was no longer the same person you knew. But your instincts keep whispering that something is wrong. Don't be too quick to doubt yourself, because it could be that this person isn't who they used to be. I'm Cinemind, I'll take my leave. Thank you for watching. See you in the next movie recap. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and activate the bell so you don't miss any of the storylines.